Chapter 3. Murder, Anna thought to herself as she took in the sight of a once beautiful woman in her 20s, laying broken against the rocks at the bottom of a quarry. This was definitely a murder. She glanced up to the abrupt drop-off the woman almost certainly fell from, given her current position and condition. The drop had to be a good 100 feet, high enough that the girl would have died instantly on impact. So that was a mercy. "Hey there, beautiful," Anna whispered as she carefully squatted down next to the body, while resisting the urge to brush a lock of hair out of the corpse's face. She found a moderately flat area to rest her work bag on as she took a moment to take in the scene. Snake print dress, fresh pedicure, open-toed heels with one stem missing. "You look like you were planning on a good night. How did you end up here?" Anna asked. The body didn't answer. Not yet. But Anna always found a way to get a story out of them. Always. And if she didn't, well then she had other options. But first, science. She did everything by the book, disrupting nothing and documenting everything as she pulled out her camera and started taking pictures of the scene. She focused on the body first, documenting positioning and condition. Aside from a few scratches that looked like they possibly came from branches scraping past, the woman looked surprisingly unscathed. Anna took pictures of each graze while searching for other marks that might give a hint as to what happened to her. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. Her nails were clean, and there was no indication she'd been held tightly or restrained. Maybe it's not murder, Anna thought. Wait on toxicology, maybe she had a bad trip and just took a dive on accident. But Anna's gut immediately disagreed with her. A woman like this, dressed for a club, pencil dress, high heels, out where the back roads end, all alone? No. Someone brought her here, someone left her here. It was murder. And there was so little to go on that Anna needed to be above reproach in getting things right. Everything was evidence at this point, with no detective in sight. Did Anna like working without anyone looking over her shoulder? Yes. Did she like that the assigned detective was always the last one on the scene? No. It drove her crazy. Everything about Detective Wolfe did, including the fact that his close rate was exceptional. And every time she started to complain about his handling of cases, people always shrugged and said, well, it seems to be working for him. And yes, it was. But he was literally ignoring the book at every turn. He did nothing right. Nothing. And he was always wandering in after everyone else had circled the scene and moved on, the last to see it. It was easier to get away with things like that in the city, where there were likely witnesses or cameras to help fill in the apathy gap. But not out here. Every detail mattered, and so did dawdling. As Anna swapped out her camera for a liver thermometer, she admonished herself for not listening to her gut when she dressed for the day and worn some fluffy socks like she wanted to. It was definitely a fluffy sock day, and she'd gone with dress socks instead. That had been her first mistake of the morning, wearing nylons with brogues, instead of the socks and boots that had called to her. She told herself it was better to look professional than to be comfortable, but she'd been wrong. Boots would be perfect for the day's terrain, and the fluffy socks would have maybe made her a little less ready to scowl as she catalogued all the things to tell the detective once he finally wandered onto the scene. Whenever possible, Anna liked to be monosyllabic with a man just like he was with her, and let her reports do the talking. Evidence was what caught criminals anyway, not entitled white men who got their jobs through connections and slept like they worked regular 8-to-5s instead of showing up to solve the murders that prematurely ended people's lives. Anna cared about people a lot, which is why she'd chosen to become an avid student of how things went wrong between people and what drove them to kill. She wouldn't be a medical examiner forever. She might not even be one in a year. But once, just once, she wanted to know what it felt like to work with a detective as passionate about creating an airtight case as she was. Detectives seriously had so much attitude, and Detective Wolfe was the worst. And while it might be her single greatest job-related wish to replace him with someone else, she had to deal with the cards she'd been dealt and remember to stay in her lane and work as if the case all rested on her. Because, truth be told, most of the time, it did. Keeping that in mind, Anna took a deep breath and looked down at the victim. Okay, honey, time to find out how long you've been laying here. And she got to work. Chapter 4. Detective Wolfe sat atop the industrial piping, a few paces from where the killer's car had been parked the night before, studying the area he taped off around daybreak. He'd started the tape at the access gate, where the vehicle's tracks were clear as could be. From there, he'd encompassed everywhere the victim and the killer had traversed beyond the gate. The killer had made no effort to hide his tracks in any fashion. From the drive-in to the cliff's edge, he'd been indifferent about leaving a trail, which didn't make sense, not when added to the nearly non-existent other clues the man had left behind. Maybe CSI would find something Wolfe hadn't once he got around to calling in the location. He hoped so, but his gut told him not to count on it. Wolfe had walked the scene several times, first tracking the female's path to the ledge, with its slips, falls, and broken branches, then her pursuers, a male who hadn't left a bent twig behind in the dark. Size 10 shoes, no tread, leather soles on a boot that was probably a cowboy style of some sort. Wolfe had marked each instant where the boots had left a good scraping against uneven rock, but felt hesitant about putting too much stock in the results. When a skilled and measured man made no effort to cover his tracks, it followed reason that he was just fine having those tracks followed, which made Wolfe hesitant to believe they were actual clues and not decoys leading to a scapegoat. He'd seen such tactics more than a few times from pros looking to tempt investigators with a fall guy. This might be one of those cases. The tracks might be lazy detective bait. He had to keep an open mind. Feeling a sheen of sweat form under his shirt as the shade of morning faded, Wolfe noted the sun climbing in the sky and took a look at his watch. It was getting late. He'd need to check in soon, but he was still waiting to get a second opinion from a partner that seemed to be in no hurry to show up. Yet her delay was giving Wolfe time to run and rerun what he'd pieced together. Things he knew? The killer and the woman had driven in together. There had been no struggle, but at some point the girl had grown nervous, skittered away, stood her ground for a few beats. Then she'd run. And the killer had let her. He'd even paced a little bit to delay his pursuit. When he'd finally followed, it hadn't been at a run, only long strides, sure-footed, without slips or fatigue, that had paused and restarted about 3/4 of the way down to the drop-off, which made Wolfe think that's when the girl fell. The killer's pace had quickened then, up until he reached the ledge, where he'd stood close enough to peer over, only a few feet from where the woman had taken her final step. Then he'd returned to his vehicle and departed, without making any effort to find his prey before leaving. She was dead, he'd known it, and he'd left. Just like that. Some might argue that a person might behave in such a way out of shock, but that didn't explain such measured behavior from the man who had made it out alive. He had never run. He'd never panicked. He hadn't even paced at the top of the cliff, as a person would almost certainly do if this had been an accident. He just walked to the edge with even steps, presumably looked over, then pivoted and left with the same measured steps. Ice cold, unnatural, and likely trained. Wolfe's upbringing had surrounded him with hunters of all types, mostly those who killed for food, although he had crossed paths with those who killed for sport or cash. One thing pretty much all killers had in common was inspecting their prey once it had fallen. That was the instinctive next step. Walking away, sight unseen, after giving a chase that never quite made it to a run, was not. This had been a passionless, dismissive kill, like a pro getting paid. Wolfe was about to hop off the piping and walk the scene again when he sensed a shift in the air and turned on instinct. Trotting up behind him, silent as a shadow, was the granddaughter of the wolf that had earned him his name back when he was a kid. "Took your time," he said, checking his watch again. 2 hours and 47 minutes, to be exact. The wolf licked her chops, as if she'd had better things to do, before skipping their usual greeting and moving to the yellow tape, nose dropping to the ground. This wasn't her first crime scene. She knew what to do. Wolfe slid from the pipes and moved to see if she picked up on anything he hadn't. After spending a dismissive amount of time where the car had been parked, she moved quickly into the foliage as Wolfe ducked the tape and paced her progress from the side. She moved into a pattern of surging forward while tracking the girl and doubling back to note the path of the hunter, giving several deep inhales every time she came across a whiff of blood. Wolfe hadn't found some of the drops in his passes. He'd have to come back with more markers. For now, he simply kept watching until she made her way to the drop-off and stopped, looking over the edge to see those working the scene below, including the ME Wolfe had to stop himself from watching too long. Happily, the she-wolf helped him out by looking up at him as if to ask, "This is why you called?" Wolfe nodded. Body language the wolf understood, along with pretty much all other body language and about 1,000 English words. "I want to catch the man and might need your help," Wolfe said. She blinked as if to say, "Duh." Wolfe tapped his boots and shook his head. "He wants us to see his feet." Then he rubbed his thumb against the pad of his fingers before holding his hand open in her direction. "Can you find anything he touched? Can you find the scent of his skin?" The she-wolf did a 180 and trotted back up the trail. If she thought he needed to see anything, she'd signal, but otherwise they were done. Wolfe could call on the CSI team now and let them have the run of the place. He was about to call on the location when he heard the light squeak of car brakes from the main entrance. Apparently someone had just found him. Probably Officer Tate. She was always the first to think outside the box. A closet detective herself, although she had yet to own as much publicly, even as she quietly shadowed all the detectives she crossed paths with, asking questions and discreetly jotting down tips she liked. The high expectations Officer Tate had for herself made her the last to see how good she really was, but she'd get there. Just like she'd use the yellow tape to deduce that he was already on the scene and find him within the next few minutes. A beat later, Wolfe felt eyes on him and turned to give a nod of goodbye to the she-wolf. Anywhere there were humans with guns, she wasn't safe. She needed to get gone. But based on her demeanor, she'd gotten what she needed. There was no reason to hang around. A beat later, she was weaving through the bushes like a shadow, like the killer had the night before. Then she was gone. Content to see how long it took Officer Tate to find him, Wolfe let his eyes move back over the ledge to where Anna Maria seemed to be packing up below. He'd been careful not to disrupt her scene when he arrived. He knew how passionate Anna Maria was about having a clean scene, although he had saved a timed-out sound file on the victim's phone before copying all the data over to a clone. The battery had been at 3%, and he hadn't wanted to lose any evidence by waiting and maybe having the phone auto-delete an unsaved file when it ran out of juice. It was amazing the phone had survived the fall at all, not to mention held its charge through the chill of night. Wolfe had gone through the victim's phone and listened to her unsaved audio file while waiting for the she-wolf. The victim hadn't named her killer. She hadn't even tried. It sounded like she'd been trying to record a message to someone, but never really gotten around to saying their name, or getting out more than several fragments of thought that sounded like it might be leaning into a confession. Nothing she'd said made sense to Wolfe, but perhaps it would to friends or family. There were no suspicious messages or texts either, although an earlier exchange did indicate she'd arrived at a downtown bar approximately 10:22 with 4 shots pre-gamed in her system. But if she'd been drunk when she arrived at this location, it didn't show in her footing. Wolfe accessed the clone phone again and started looking through her selfies. She seemed to have a core group of 5 friends she spent a lot of time with, including last night. Wolfe wanted to be the first to talk to all of them. He revisited her photo gallery as he took note of Officer Tate coming down the decline on the opposite side of the yellow tape he was standing on. He waited her out, eyes on the phone as she approached in his blind spot. "There you are," she said, stepping into view. Only then did Detective Wolfe turn around and greet her with a nod. "Good morning, Officer Tate." Her cheeks flushed inexplicably as she brushed an imaginary strand of hair away from her face. "Good morning, Detective." Then she glanced behind her. "No one knows you're on the scene yet." He nodded. "That's good." Her mouth opened as she pushed the button on her radio. Then she seemed to rethink the move and released it. The Emmy wants to talk to you." Detective Wolfe ignored the shiver that ran up his neck. "I'll check in with her at the station." Tate grimaced slightly. "Well, she's kind of vocal about wanting to point out something to the detective on the case while she's still on the scene." Wolfe nodded. "She'll put the observation in her report. She's very thorough." "She is that," Tate agreed with a nervous laugh, as she walked forward to join him at the edge of the ledge, each of them on opposite sides of the yellow tape that framed the distance between where the victim had fallen and where the killer had stood. "Getting a feel for the scene?" she asked. "Getting a feel for the scene," he replied. Officer Tate looked down to where the body lay below, and Wolfe watched her pass through a moment of vertigo as she registered the height and inched back a step. "Wow, that's a drop," she said. "It is," he agreed. She recovered quickly and moved right into her usual covert student mode. "Got any theories?" Wolfe shook his head. "Just a lot of questions." Tate nodded as if that made sense, while taking a second look at the taped area. "What makes you think she went over here?" "Tracks," he said, pointing about 2 feet to her left. "She took her last step there." Then he pointed about 3 feet away from where he stood. "And the killer turned around there." "It's all rocky here," she pointed out. "How can you tell?" "Scuffs," he said, keeping it simple. She squatted down, trying to see what he saw, but Wolfe could tell she didn't know where to focus or what to look for. Maybe he'd teach her someday, but not today. Not on a scene. Somewhere else where no stakes were involved. "You want to call this in?" he asked, before she could ask a follow-up question. "I've done my thing. Time to bring in a team." Tate straightened, her hand going to her radio again. "You got it, Detective." And by the time CSI arrived, Wolfe was on his way out. It was time to break the news, and to start his own hunt to find out who killed Mariah Jane Austen. This concludes Chapter 4. If you like this story, please like and subscribe for more. And remember, full stories in the Pimpernel world are available on Amazon.com.